In this video, we're going to cover one of the most important documents called the assumption log that we have to create and also update from the beginning of the project all the way up to the end of the project during any project execution. So let us look at the actual definition of an assumption log. All right. So as you can see on the screen, an assumption is a factor in the planning process that are considered to be true, real, or even certain without proof or demonstration. So let me explain on this. Assumption is something that you want to consider to be true, okay, to be real or not to be changing even during the course of the project. For example, you can assume that the equipment is going to be available on time. You can also assume that the same project team is going to be maintained throughout the project. You can also even assume that none of the expected risk in terms of, say, financial risk is going to be expected. So what it means is you are making something true without providing proof. So what does that mean? It means at one point or the other during the project, this has to be validated, and you should always put a date to validate the assumption so that you don't keep something which might end up being a risk, because an assumption can be noticed today. It can be also logged in the assumption log, but later on it can turn into a risk, assuming you were expecting the team to be the same, but now there are some resignations, some are being recalled back to some functional departments, and so on and so forth. So you end up with a risk. If an assumption is actually something that has already happened, then it becomes an issue. So it's quite important to understand that an assumption is something that is considered to be true, to be real, and also certain without providing any proof or any demonstrations. So that is very, very important. Then a constraint is considered to be a limiting factor that affect the execution of a project, such as predetermined budgets or fixed milestones. So let me expand a bit on this. Constraints, they're always everywhere. In every project environment, you always find some constraints. It could be a resource constraint, which could be a human or non-human. It could be a financial constraint, which could be budget budget. It could be a financial constraint, which could be budget. It can also be a constraint in terms of schedule. You're supposed to deliver something in 6 months. You can't go beyond that, especially when it comes to regulatory projects. You cannot go beyond a certain date because it's affecting probably the whole country or even the whole region that you're staying in. So constraints, you always find them. And constraints, they are always captured also during the project charter. So you might be asking, what is a project charter? A project charter is a document that is used to approve or to authorize the start of a project, and it's also used to give authority to the project manager and also to the project sponsor. If you want to understand more about project charter, I've created a full video on project charter. You can also watch it on my channel. I'll also leave a link in the description below. So you should be able to understand the distinction between an assumption and a constraint. An assumption is something that is considered to be real, true, or even certain without providing proof or even demonstration. And then a constraint is something that is a limiting factor, something that is not going to give you more flexibility in terms of what you want to do in a project environment. For example, it could be a schedule limit, it could be a budget limit, it could be even a team size limit that can also come, it could be a technical limit. So constraints, they all come in different categories. So you could be asking, Oscar, at what point do we capture or do we create this assumption log? The assumption log is actually created during the initiation stage of the project. That is creation. Get this right. Creation is during initiation of the project. However, when it comes to updating assumption log, it's updated from the initiation of the project all the way up to the end of the project. So do not make a mistake I've seen with some other project managers in the field. They just create the assumption log initially just to demonstrate to either senior management or to the client that they have assumptions. And then throughout the project, they become or they claim to be busy, and then they forget or they intentionally do not update the assumption log. Assumption log is supposed to be updated from the beginning of the project, during the project, and also at the end of the project. So you could be asking, at what can cause these assumptions to be updated? There are so many points or phases in a project where this assumption has to be updated. For example, when you're planning, which means you've moved from initiation to planning, there are a lot of assumptions that you have to consider throughout the planning process. Or even when you're doing procurement, there are also certain assumptions that you put into consideration. For example, if it's a software development project, you might also consider that during testing or even during cutover. So there are quite a number of points in a project environment where you have to consider the assumptions. And you should always come back to the assumption log, update it, and validate it, assign it to someone else, make sure there's also a date to make sure that the validation is actually done. So assumption log is something created during initiation, updated all the way up to the end of the project. So let us understand and appreciate why it matters to have an assumption log. So the first point that you have to consider is to reduce risk. So once you assume something, it gives you an opportunity to actually analyze it, to actually validate it before it becomes a risk. I can give you a good example. You can assume that, let me give you an example of a software project. So you might assume that the old servers, they are going to be, or old infrastructure is going to be used as part of the new project. However, during the project, you might discover, or you can be advised by the technical team, that there's a compatibility issue, which means the previous infrastructure or the servers, they can't be used in the new project. Therefore, you're forced to go for procurement to make sure there's availability of the infrastructure that you're going to use to run the software. So this is how the risk comes into play. You are assuming that you're going to use the existing infrastructure, but now you're forced to go to procurement. So the risk is the project is going to be delayed, likely, or you're likely going to exceed your budget, or you're going to expand your budget. So assumption log is actually very important to reduce the risk. You also have to drive action. Assumption log is also very important to drive action. What do you mean by this? When we assume something, you come up with an action plan to validate it, and even the dates to validate it, so that you're quite sure whether you're going to be continuing with that assumption, or you're going to close it, or you're going to put in place, if it's a risk mitigation activities or measures, to make sure that if it changes, it doesn't affect the project. So that is quite important to understand, that a assumption log is also used to drive action. Then, especially during the initiation stage, where you're creating probably a project charter, or you're identifying some stakeholders, it's also very important to use assumptions for alignment, because either the organization senior management or program managers or portfolio managers, they want to appreciate what was the basis of your estimates, what was the basis of your documentation, what was the basis of your requirements collection, as an example. So assumption log can also be used for alignment. You were, for example, you were gathering some requirements, and you assumed that the people who are giving the requirements, they are competent enough or they're experienced enough to provide the requirements as a complete set. That's an assumption. Assuming you got some new members in a department who are supplying or who are giving requirements, then definitely that assumption might not be valid for some time. So it's also used for alignment. Do not make a mistake that I've seen with some other project managers. They just update assumption log just at the beginning of the project. Assumption log is actually a living document. What do we mean by living document? A living document, it means it can be changed anytime. You don't need to go for change request to change assumptions. So it's one of the documents that is used during the project, and it's one of the documents that is also archived when the project is closed. So assumption is very important, because in the next project or as part of the organization, It can also be used to pick some of the lessons learned that you are going to use or to update as you close the project. So take the assumption log as a living document. It's something that can be updated from the beginning of the project all the way up to the end of the project. I hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe button, and the notification button so that you're the first person to be notified each time a new video is uploaded on this channel. It will also help the channel to grow. It will also help the channel to produce more videos like this one. So in this section of the video, we are going to cover the 8 elements or key fields that you should expect in an assumption log. These are very important fields, and like I said earlier, at one point you might need to tailor them specific to your project, but these are basics that are expected to be part of your assumption log. So let us go through them one by one. So the first one is a unique ID. I can tell you from my experience, there is no way you can run a project without assigning unique IDs, whether it's a risk ID, whether it's an issue ID, or whether it's even a plan. It might have the action items, they have also IDs. So the same also applies to assumption log. There must be a way to number your IDs. It could be something you want to use numerical, or you want to use alphanumerical, which means you're mixing both of them. And then this ID is used as a reference. Like I said earlier, if you have created, say, 3 or 4 assumptions during the initiation stage, you should be able to reference those assumptions at any stage of the project, either during the execution or even towards the closure of the project. So how do you make that reference? You only make that reference using that unique ID. So your assumption log must have a unique ID. You're going to see it when you go through an example of an assumption log. It must have a unique ID. Then the second one is it must have a category. Let me expand on this. An assumption log must have a category. What do we mean by this? You should be able to categorize every assumption that you might make in a project environment. Examples of categories that you can have it as a technical assumption. Okay, category is technical, or it could be management. You're assuming from a management point of view. It could be even quality. So these categories, you can come up with any specific categories that works well with the current project that you're executing, or the industry of the project also that you're executing, even the type of the project that you're also executing. So you first come up with the categories, and then when you're capturing the assumption log, you put those specific categories. Is it technical? Is it financial? Is it management? Is it human resources? Is it research and development? You know, so all those things you also need to capture. So make sure your assumption log also captures the category. Then the third one is the actual assumption. So you need to capture the actual assumption. What is the actual assumption that you have? It must be well documented, and don't make it too brief that it might not make any sense. So your assumption should always be documented. Even the constraint that we have, you can also document it very well in the assumption log. So make sure that the actual assumption is very descriptive, is very clear. People can understand what is the assumption in this particular item. Okay. Then assumption should always be validated. So how do we validate? We need to make sure we assign a responsible party, someone who's going to follow up and validate, either move the assumption from assumption to risk or to issue, or someone who's going to close it, that it's no longer a problem. Okay, so responsible party should be part of what the assumption log should contain in the project environment. Then, once you have assigned the responsible party, you are also supposed to put the due date. Let me share with you my experience in projects. If there's anything that has to be done in a project, you should always make sure that it has got a delivery or due date. The reason why you should have a due date is for you to be able to see whether you're on track or not on track. Do you want to crash the resources? Do you want to fast track the resources? And so on and so forth. So it depends. For example, it might affect schedule. So if you know, by this date, if we don't do this particular activity, it might affect the project. If you don't have dates or due dates, it will be very difficult to track progress and also to push for work to be completed, okay? So there must be a due date. That on a specific date, you must have validated this particular assumption. You must have either validated and close it, or you validate and move it to become a risk. So that is very, very important to also put through. Then, in the assumption log, one of the most important items also to consider is item to consider is the actions. So what do you mean by action? There must be some clarity or some plan as to how are you going to address the assumption. So those are what we're calling action items. How are you going to validate the assumption? Are you going to, you see, assumption, you're just trying to get some proof. Yes, you're trying to get some demonstration as to whether something is still valid or can it maintain that state up to the end of the project. So there are certain actions that you have to take. So it has to be part of the assumption log. Put the certain actions that you have to take. You're going to see that as we go through one of the assumption example or assumption log example that we're going to cover in this video. Okay. Then also the status. You must be able to record the status of the assumption. Is it still active? Is it closed? Assumption log is also very, very important because the moment you start validating, you're also going to be able to come up with the status. Open, closed, active or not. It depends on the status that you are using in the project. Remember, when you're creating your project plan, there are certain strategies that you're going to come up with. One of them is how are we going to create status? Is it going to be open, active, pending? Depending on the number of status categories that you want to consider. But in an assumption log, you must have a status to show what exactly is the status of the current assumption item. Then the last one is always comments or remarks. What do you mean by this? As we have already elaborated, the assumption can be detailed, but you want to add more information. For example, you want to add alternative routes, you want to add alternative actions to take, or you want to add alternative maybe vendor to use. So comments you can put, it's a freestyle field. You can put as much information as you think is going to be helpful in terms of explaining or in terms of presenting the assumption log item. So those are the 8 specific elements or categories that you have to consider when you are creating an assumption log. It must have a unique ID. It must have a category. It must be very descriptive as an assumption or as a constraint. And it must also have a responsible part. It must have a due date, the action items that you are going to take, and also the status, then the comments. So in this section of the video, we are now going to have a look at a symbol of an assumption log so that whatever we've discussed earlier, it actually makes sense. So let us go through this symbol so that we appreciate how it looks like, or we feel how it looks like to have an assumption log in a project environment. So let us have a look at this example where we are implementing a software implementation project. Okay, so as you can see on the screen, we have the ID and the assumption, just say A001. You can put whatever ID you want. You can also use the organization, it's a naming convention to come up with this. Or maybe we talk of the categories. On categories, we have, say for example, technical category. We also have a resource category. We also have budget category, external or internal category. You can also put it as a schedule category. So when it comes to the assumptions or the constraints, which we said it must be well documented. Say for example, we take assumption 001. It means that the development server will be available from project kickoff. That's an assumption. So who is going to be responsible for that? It's going to be the IT manager. And what is the due date? Remember, you have to put the due date. It has to be October 1st. And what is the status of the assumption log? Is active. You can also put the additional column we discussed earlier where you put the comments. Then if we look at assumption number 2, which is the resource, we have 3 full-time employees, FTE, developers, available full-time for 6 months. That's an assumption. So who is going to be responsible for this? This is going to be the HR director, as an example. And when is it going to be due? It's going to be due on 15th of September. And it's also active, which means the assumption is still under consideration. Then you also have the budget as an example. The budget kept at 500,000. It's a constraint. It's not so much of an assumption. So who is responsible for that? Is the sponsor. And do we have a specific date? In some cases, it might not have a specific date because it's already known. So it becomes there's no due date. But in most cases, try by all means to put the due date. Then that is active. We look at external, okay, which is second from the bottom. We have the vendor API will remain stable throughout integration. That's an assumption. So a responsible party is going to be the technical lead, and it's going to be due by 20th of October. This is transferred. So remember the three status we discussed on assumption. It's active, transferred, or it's closed. So if you look at assumption A003, this has been transferred. It means it has not been proven to be true. It has been proven to be false. So it's being moved to a risk log or even an issue log, depending. It cannot be on both. Risk is something that is expected to happen in future, but an issue is something that has already happened, or it's a risk that has already materialized. So this one is transferred. Then if you look at the last one, which is A004, which is a schedule category, it means the assumption here is user acceptance testing, which is UAT sign-off, requires only 2 weeks. Then the responsible party is the quality assurance lead, QA lead, is supposed to be due by 10th of November, and it has been closed. So which means if the assumption has been closed, it means it has been validated and it has been proven to be true. Remember, when you're making assumptions, you're not providing any proof, you're not providing any demonstration. So during the project, you still need to provide proof or demonstration to validate that assumption. So if you were able to prove the assumption to be true, then it becomes closed on the assumption log. If you want me to create more videos based on what we have covered in this video, you can also reach out to me, or you can let me know in the comment section below. Thank you for watching.